He was sent to inspect an old Riverside house no one dared to touch. Rotting wood, shattered windows, and a past the town tried to forget. Stephen Archer, a 60-year-old veteran turned realtor, thought it was just another abandoned listing. But everything changed when his loyal German shepherd Bear began scratching at the warped floorboards. And together they uncovered a rusted metal box, sealed tight and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were letters, receipts, and photographs that pointed to a long-buried secret, proof of corruption, betrayal, and the quiet heroism of a woman the town had wrongly condemned. What began as a simple restoration became a story of courage, sacrifice, and grace, one that would redeem a forgotten soul and heal an entire community. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. The mist hung low over the valley that morning, pale as breath against the dark shoulders of Oregon's Silver Bend hills. The river murmured beneath it, a slow metallic song twisting between the oaks whose leaves had turned the color of old copper. Stephen Archer steered his old blue pickup down the dirt road that ran beside the Rogue River, the wheels biting into soft mud from last night's drizzle. He was 60, tall and lean, with the kind of frame that spoke of long years lifting more than his share of weight. Hoses, debris, bodies, regrets. His hair, streaked silver and iron, curled slightly under the edges of a faded canvas cap. The stubble along his jaw was a shade darker than the fog, and his eyes, a quiet gray blue, carried both patience and a weight he no longer tried to hide. There was a stillness to him, not the lazy kind, but the kind that came after too many alarms, too many dawns where something burned that shouldn't have. On the passenger seat sat Bear, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat, one ear nicked at the tip like a torn page in a book that had seen too much. The dog's gaze was steady, amber bright and old with knowing. Bear had served with Stephen years ago when both belonged to the county's rescue division. Stephen with his rope and lungs of iron, Bear with his scent for life under rubble. They had pulled people out of floodwater, smoke, twisted cabins. They had also carried silence together when one day 15 years back, a roof collapsed before Stephen could reach a trapped child. Since then, even in his new life as a real estate broker, he sometimes woke gasping as if smoke still filled his chest. He told himself that selling houses was another kind of rescue. A home forgotten could die like a person, and sometimes, when he restored a broken place, he felt the faintest redemption. The truck slowed before a rusted gate where weeds tangled like uncut hair. A wooden sign swung crookedly. Finch property, no trespassing. Stephen killed the engine and stepped out, the air thick with pine seep and damp earth. He straightened his brown waxed jacket, the one with scorch marks near the cuff, and let his eyes travel up the slope. There it was. The house. 2 stories of silvered timber and sorrow, half sunk into the hillside, its porch sagging under moss. The shutters hung like broken wings. It had been empty 10 years, ever since Eleanor Finch, a midwife once beloved and later whispered about as the Fire Witch, died alone. Locals claimed she'd burned the town's grain store during the flood of 2007. No charges, no proof, just the easy cruelty of rumor. Bear gave a low, questioning bark. Stephen bent, brushing the dog's fur. Easy, boy, just ghosts and dust. But Bear's tail barely moved. The hackles along his spine rippled like grass before a gust. The two crossed the yard. The grass was knee-high, silvered by dew. Stephen's boots left dark trails, the sound of his steps swallowed by the fog. When he reached the porch, he paused. The front door hung slightly open, not from wind but from age. Inside, a faint scent of mold and something older, old wood smoke, maybe, drifted out. He pushed the door wider, flashlight in hand. The beam caught floating dust motes and the curled edges of wallpaper patterned with faded violets. Time had lived here, but so had something else. In the front room, furniture stood as if waiting for someone's return. A rocking chair near the window, a sewing basket still half full of thread, and a small table with a cracked photo frame, its glass veined, its picture water-stained but still visible. A woman, thin and smiling faintly, hair pulled back, stood beside a cradle. "So that's you, Eleanor," Stephen murmured. "You look tired." His voice echoed soft, respectful. Bear circled once, nose twitching, then sat facing the narrow hallway as though guarding it. Stephen crouched beside an old trunk and tried its latch, locked. On its side, someone had scratched the initials EF with a nail. He noted it down in his pad out of habit. A realtor's routine often calmed him. Measure, document, detach. But here it didn't. Here, the silence had memory. From the corner came a slow creak. Stephen turned. The rocking chair swayed once, then stopped. He exhaled through his nose. Probably drafts. But Bear was staring, ears rigid, eyes fixed not at the chair, but slightly above it, toward the staircase that vanished into shadow. Stephen followed the gaze and felt the faint chill crawl along his neck. On the wall beside the stairs hung a mirror darkened by grime. As his flashlight crossed it, for an instant, his reflection blurred, not into another face, but into a shimmer of orange, the color of flame licking up through smoke. He blinked hard, the image gone. "You're seeing ghosts again," he muttered. "Just nerves." Still, his fingers brushed the small brass badge in his pocket, the one from his firefighter days, burnished smooth from years of worry. Upstairs, a faint thump echoed, soft but deliberate. Bear growled low. "Squirrel," Stephen said automatically, though it sounded like a lie. He hesitated, then mounted the first stair. They groaned under his weight, dry and protesting. Each step stirred faint smells, dust, cedar, rain once trapped in wood. Halfway up, he caught the outline of something at the landing, a curtain moving though that no window was open. The light cut across the fabric. Faint writing scrawled in charcoal along its hem caught his eye. "Forgive me, for I had to save them." His heart tightened. The handwriting was firm but feminine, looping like someone used to writing names on certificates of birth. He thought of Eleanor, blamed for a fire during a flood, a woman who had delivered half the town's children and died with none of them at her funeral. Maybe the house wasn't haunted. Maybe it was just waiting to be heard. In the back of his mind, another sound rose, a child's cry from a memory long sealed. He shook it off, focusing on the here and now. The upstairs hallway stretched narrow, lined with closed doors. He opened the nearest, bedroom. The quilt still spread on the bed, yellowed lace at the edges. On the nightstand, a kerosene lamp and a stack of notebooks bound in cloth. He reached for one, then stopped, as Bear barked sharply from downstairs. The bark wasn't fear, it was warning. Stephen hurried down, boots thudding, beam bouncing off walls. The front door stood ajar, though he was sure he'd pushed it mostly closed. Outside, through the mist, he saw tracks, fresh tire marks curving off the gravel path, ending near the fence. Someone else had been here recently. He bent, touching the ground, still damp from the weight of rubber. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing. Bear sniffed the air and whined, then looked toward the river. There, half hidden by reeds, something glinted, metal catching weak sunlight. Stephen walked closer, knees bending, and found a brass pocket watch, ornate but tarnished, its back engraved with initials worn by time. He wiped the surface gently, reading under his breath. WB. He didn't recognize it, but a strange unease crept through him. He glanced back at the house. In the upper window, for the briefest instant, he thought he saw movement, someone's silhouette framed by torn lace. Then it vanished. Bear barked once, loud and sharp. The fog thickened around them, as if swallowing the road home. Stephen slipped the watch into his pocket, unaware that its hands were frozen at 11:47, the very minute the old grain store had burned 15 years ago. The morning mist over Silver Bend had thinned into a pale ribbon of light, trailing through the sycamores that leaned toward the Rogue River. Stephen Archer parked his dusty pickup outside a small corner shop, whose sign read Rivers and Pages, Coffee and Books. The place had a kind of quiet gravity, like a chapel for the weary. Inside, the scent of roasted beans mingled with the must of old pages, and the soft hum of an old record player filled the air. Grace Alden, 58, stood behind the counter, tall and slender with chestnut hair streaked silver and tied loosely at her nape. Her hazel eyes carried the softness of someone who had learned to listen more than speak, and her hands, always warm, seemed to move with the rhythm of memory. She had been a widow for nearly 10 years, since her husband, a high school literature teacher, had passed suddenly one September night. She wore a dark olive cardigan and a linen apron, her name embroidered in fading thread. When she smiled, it was like the faint chime of wind bells. "Stephen Archer," she said, as though recalling a verse she hadn't read in years, "the man trying to sell the river's ghost." He smiled faintly, removing his cap, his weathered face creasing around his eyes. "And you must be the librarian everyone calls the town's conscience." Grace chuckled softly, pouring him a cup of coffee so black it seemed to absorb the morning light. In this town, everyone's conscience needs caffeine. She wrote his name into a worn notebook labeled The Ledger of Second Chances, a list of those who couldn't quite afford a cup that day, or perhaps just needed to be remembered. "Coffee's on me today," she said gently. "Consider it an advance on hope." Stephen sipped, the warmth steadying his thoughts. Grace leaned closer. "You've been to the Finch place, haven't you?" Her tone dropped like a curtain lowering in an old theater. "People still whisper about Eleanor." Stephen nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've seen what's left of her house. The place feels unsettled." Grace sighed, wiping the counter though it was already clean. 15 years ago, the night the old grain barn burned, Eleanor disappeared. The town turned on her, said she lit the fire herself to cover something, but no one could ever prove it. Funny thing though, the next morning food aid from across the river arrived early, in time to save half the town from starving that winter. She paused, meeting Stephen's eyes. Maybe not all bad deeds are what they seem. Stephen traced the rim of his cup, his mind echoing the same moral confusion that had haunted him since that failed rescue years ago, the weight of not knowing whether saving one life had meant losing another. "In my line of work," he murmured, "smoke doesn't always tell the truth." Just then the door swung open, and the quiet equilibrium of the shop shifted. Warren Blake entered, a man whose presence filled any room like a storm cloud. 55, broad-shouldered, slick dark gray hair combed back, his suit a perfect shade between ambition and threat. His steel gray eyes missed nothing. He made his fortune in land development, turning forgotten fields into golf courses and old barns into boutique hotels. To some, he was Silver Bend's savior. To others, its undertaker. "Archer," Blake said, removing his leather gloves with deliberate precision, "I heard you've taken on the Finch property." His voice was smooth but carried the undertone of a challenge. "Sell it to me. That riverfront lot is wasted on ghost stories." Stephen leaned back slightly, studying him. "You planning another resort?" Blake smirked. "A wellness retreat. People pay fortunes to find peace near rivers now." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, a preliminary offer. "I'll handle the permits, the cleanup, everything. You get your commission, and Silver Bend gets progress. Seems fair." Grace stiffened behind the counter. "Progress built on graves doesn't last long, Mr. Blake." He turned to her, the politeness in his face thinning. "Mrs. Alden, I admire your idealism, but nostalgia doesn't pay property tax." Stephen folded his hands calmly. "You're moving fast, Blake. What's the rush?" Blake's jaw tightened. "Let's just say that land's about to become complicated. The sooner you let go of it, the better." Something flickered in Stephen's chest, a familiar instinct, the same one that made him run toward burning buildings years ago. He didn't trust the smell of this deal. "I'll think about it," he said simply, finishing his coffee. Blake smirked, tapping the offer against the counter before leaving. "Don't think too long, Archer. Fire spreads faster than hesitation." The bell above the door chimed as he left, the sound lingering like the echo of a match strike. Grace sighed. He's the kind who buys history only to repaint it. Stephen stood by the window, watching Blake's sleek car disappear into the fog that had returned to the riverbank. Bear, sitting obediently by the door, let out a low growl, as if sensing something rotten in the air. Stephen crouched, scratching behind his ear. "You smell it too, don't you, boy?" The dog's amber eyes flicked toward the river's shimmer beyond the trees. Grace's voice softened. "If you're planning to go back there, be careful. People say strange lights still move around that house at night, like someone walking the halls with a lantern." Stephen smiled faintly, though his heart quickened. "I've chased stranger lights in darker places." As he stepped out into the damp air, Bear close behind, a wind swept across the street, scattering brittle leaves like forgotten letters. Across the river, something glimmered near the Finch house, just a pale, wavering glow, too steady to be a reflection. Stephen narrowed his eyes, pulse tightening. It looked like the shape of a woman's silhouette moving across the porch, but when he blinked, the figure was gone. That night, as the moon rose low and red over Silver Bend, Stephen dreamed of fire, of smoke curling through rafters, of a woman's voice calling from somewhere he could never reach. And when he woke before dawn, Bear was already standing by the door, ears pricked toward the river, waiting. The fog had lifted, but the air in Silver Bend remained heavy, as though the town itself were holding its breath. Stephen Archer parked his old pickup by the abandoned Riverside house once more, its gray timbers gleaming faintly in the late autumn sun. The wind carried a scent of wet pine and something faintly metallic, like old secrets refusing to rust. Bear, his 6-year-old German shepherd, with black and tan fur and one torn ear, leapt down first, tail steady, eyes alert. To anyone else, he was just a dog, but to Stephen, Bear was the compass that still pointed home when memory faltered. They entered the house quietly. Dust motes drifted through a shaft of light like slow-falling snow. Stephen traced the grooves on the staircase with a gloved hand. The boards complained beneath each step, yet there was a rhythm to it, a heartbeat of wood long forgotten. Upstairs, a door hung slightly ajar. Bear sniffed, then pawed at a loose plank on the attic floor. "You smell it too, huh, boy?" Stephen murmured. The plank gave way with a hollow clack, revealing a wooden box beneath. Inside lay old notebooks, yellowed receipts, and letters tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. Among them, several pages bore the symbol of a small circle, enclosing the letters AC. Stephen frowned. The handwriting was elegant, neat, Eleanor Finch's no doubt. But that circle, the accountant's mark, appeared beside transactions linked to the Flood Relief Fund, 2007. He read further. Eleanor's words were simple, deliberate. "If they come again, I'll stay silent. Truth was spoken once and ignored, but I keep the proof." He sat back, the attic creaking beneath his weight. A memory stirred, the roar of flames years ago, the night a roof collapsed only a yard from his reach, a woman's voice calling through the smoke, and the silence that followed. That failure had driven him from the department, from the life he knew. He had promised himself never again to mistake noise for truth. Now, these pages whispered of something that burned long before the fire. Grace Alden would know how to interpret it, he thought. Her bookshop cafe, Rivers and Pages, had become Silver Ben's unofficial archive of forgotten truths. But before he could leave, he noticed a name recurring at the bottom of the ledgers. W. Blake, Warren Blake, the real estate investor who had cornered him at the cafe, his charcoal gray suit as sharp as his tongue. Stephen exhaled slowly. "You again," he muttered. He took the box to his truck and drove toward town. The roads twisted through oaks and maples, now half bare, the sunlight cutting like amber glass through their limbs. Bear rested his chin on the window ledge, watching the world blur by. "What do you think, pal?" Stephen asked. "A good man wouldn't hide behind charity funds." Bear huffed softly, tail flicking once. At Rivers and Pages, the bell chimed softly as Stephen entered. Grace looked up from the counter, her hazel eyes warm behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was 58, slender, with silver strands glinting through her brown hair, the kind of woman whose presence quieted a room rather than filled it. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked, her tone half statement, half intuition. Stephen placed the ledger on the table. Grace unfolded her reading glasses and leaned close. "The AC mark," she said thoughtfully. "That's Avery Collins. He used to be the town accountant before he moved east after the flood scandal." She turned a page. "And these numbers don't add up. Funds withdrawn, unaccounted for, then the grain shipment that saved half the town arrives the very next day." She looked up. Eleanor wasn't the villain, Stephen. She may have taken the blame to protect someone, or expose them. The door jingled again. A man entered, tall and angular, wrapped in a long tan coat flecked with drizzle. His hair was silver blonde, eyes pale green, face weathered yet sharp with a certain vigilance. Grace smiled faintly. "Stephen, this is Sheriff Dean Harwood. He's been with the county 30 years, knows every rumor from here to Medford." Harwood nodded once, his voice gravelly but calm. "Heard you're digging around the Finch place." Stephen met his gaze, trying to understand what burned more, her house or her name. The sheriff studied him for a moment, then said, "Careful where you step. Silver Ben has long memories, and some of them bite." There was no malice in his tone, only tired experience. He was a man carved by too many winters, the kind who had seen enough to lose faith in easy answers. Later, as the afternoon waned, Grace brewed them coffee strong enough to stir ghosts. She told them about the old rumor. Eleanor Finch had refused to sign a relief ledger. A week later, the barn burned. "Some said she did it out of guilt, others that she was silenced," Grace murmured. The circle, AC, appeared in every donation record after that. Stephen listened, the name Avery Collins turning over in his mind like a cold coin. "Where can I find him now?" he asked. The sheriff scratched his chin. "Last I heard, Portland. Keeps to himself these days. Used to balance numbers, now he builds boats." Night found Stephen back at the river road. The air smelled of wet cedar. He parked by the bridge, the river below reflecting the first frost of stars. Bear leapt down, nose twitching. Something glimmered beneath the porch of the Finch house, a metallic flash. Stephen crouched and pulled free a rusted tin box. Inside were photographs. Eleanor standing beside sacks of grain marked with a foreign seal. Men in suits shaking hands. A burned envelope, its wax stamp melted but faintly circular. Another AC. Behind him, Bear's low growl broke the silence. Across the river, a car idled, its headlights dimmed. Stephen's pulse quickened. He could barely make out a silhouette inside, broad-shouldered, motionless, watching. Then, as he rose, the engine roared and the car sped off, taillights vanishing into the mist. Bear barked once, sharp and echoing. Stephen whispered, "We're not just chasing ghosts, are we?" He tucked the photographs into his jacket. Back in town, lights still glowed in rivers and pages. Grace had waited, concern softening her features. Stephen laid the photos on the table. "He's still covering his tracks," he said. "Whoever he is." Grace traced the burned edge of the envelope. "Or whoever's still afraid of what Eleanor left behind." Her voice trembled, though she quickly masked it with a smile. "You know, I once helped Eleanor pack her things after the flood. She told me, 'The truth never dies, Grace. It just waits for a braver season.'" Stephen met her gaze. Then maybe that season's come. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A book on the cafe shelf, its spine marked with the same faint AC seal. He pulled it down. Inside the front cover was a note in Eleanor's handwriting. "If this ever finds you, look beneath the floor where the river bends twice." Stephen froze. The phrase meant nothing to him. Yet Bear, lying near the door, lifted his head and whined softly, ears twitching as though he knew that place already. The river bent twice, only once in Silver Bend, just beyond the old mill, on land Warren Blake now claimed for his resort project. Stephen closed the book slowly. "Grace," he said, voice low, "that land, does Blake own all of it?" She hesitated. "Almost. Except for one forgotten acre, technically still in Eleanor's name." The air between them thickened. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like impatient hands. Stephen left with Bear at his heel, the book tucked under his arm. The night smelled of rain and smoke. In the distance, thunder rolled, a warning or a memory, he couldn't tell. When he reached the bridge again, he thought he saw movement near the water, a flicker of lantern light, yellow, wavering, then gone. Bear's growl deepened. Stephen whispered, "Not now, old friend." Yet his voice betrayed something between dread and recognition. The past, it seemed, was not done burning. By dawn, the Rogue River muttered beneath a gray sky, swollen and restless. The forecast had warned of heavy rain from the mountains, but Stephen Archer felt a different kind of storm gathering, one of conscience and consequence. He stood at the window of the Finch house, his breath clouding the glass. The scent of damp earth and old timber filled the air. Bear lay nearby, head lifted, ears pricked toward the distant rumble of the river. "She hid the truth right under their noses," Stephen murmured. The box of papers from the night before lay open on the table, receipts, ledgers, photographs, and the unmistakable circular mark, AC. Grace Alden arrived not long after, her olive gray coat buttoned to the neck, hair pulled back beneath a wool beret, a notebook tucked under her arm. Despite her calm, there was tension in her step, the quiet strength of someone used to keeping other people's secrets. "The rain's coming sooner," she said softly. "The bridge might flood by nightfall." She set down a thermos of coffee. "We should finish looking while we can." Together they sorted through the receipts. Grace read aloud, "Flour, 5 sacks, delivered to Harlan Street families. Rice, distributed to the old mission." Her finger paused. "These are signed only with an X, no official stamp, no committee mark." Stephen leaned closer. "She gave the supplies directly to the people, cut out the middlemen." Grace nodded. "That would have made her enemies. The committee wouldn't have tolerated being exposed." A low growl rose from Bear's throat. The dog padded toward the kitchen, nose twitching. Stephen followed, crouching beside him. One of the old cupboards stood slightly ajar. He pulled it open, and the back panel shifted. A hidden seam. With a gentle push, a thin board popped free. Inside was a tin box wrapped in waxed paper, perfectly sealed against the years. Inside lay original receipts stamped Relief Committee 2007, matching Eleanor's handwriting, but the signatures had been forged. And there, in the corner of one photograph, was the faint silhouette of a man in a peaked cap standing beside a grain truck. His wrist glimmered with the reflection of a gold watch. Stephen's pulse quickened. Warren Blake wore one just like it, always flaunting it, a rare model imported from Zurich, engraved with his initials. Grace looked over his shoulder, her brow furrowed. If that's Blake, then this wasn't charity, it was cover-up. Stephen nodded slowly. He burned the warehouse to erase the trail. Eleanor must have found out. Rain began to fall in earnest, drumming softly on the roof. Bear's tail twitched uneasily. We need to make copies, Stephen said. Grace hesitated. If you go after Blake without proof, he'll ruin you, Stephen. He's got half the council in his pocket. Her voice trembled faintly, not out of fear for herself, but for him. You fought fires all your life. Some burn, quietly. Stephen met her gaze. And some need to. They drove to Rivers and Pages through the rising mist. The main street of Silver Bend looked like a watercolor blurred by rain. Across from the cafe, a narrow figure watched from beneath an umbrella, a woman in her late 40s with chestnut hair streaked gray, dressed in a navy raincoat. Grace noticed her first. That's Margaret Lang, Blake's assistant, she whispered. Used to be a journalist before she joined his firm. Margaret was tall, with sharp eyes that seemed to weigh everything before speaking. She stepped forward as Stephen and Grace exited the truck. Mr. Archer, she called, her voice level. Mr. Blake asked me to deliver a message. He suggests you stop digging through old ashes before someone gets burned again. Stephen tilted his head. Tell him some fires start from lightning, not matches. She didn't reply, but her expression softened slightly, almost regretful. Then she turned and walked away, her reflection rippling in the puddles like a warning fading downstream. Inside the shop, Grace began scanning the documents, while Stephen checked the photographs under a reading lamp. In the margins of one ledger, faint pencil marks spelled, Bridge Fund Diversion, Ask AC. Avery Collins again, Grace said. If we could find him, maybe he'd talk. The rain hammered louder. Bear lay by the door, restless. Just as Stephen was packing up, Sheriff Dean Harwood entered, soaked but calm, his tan jacket dripping onto the floorboards. His lined face looked graver than before. Heard your name floating around Council Hall, he said. Blake's stirring trouble. Claims you're trespassing, tampering with evidence. Stephen handed him the photograph. Then let him explain this. The sheriff squinted at the image, his pale green eyes narrowing. That looks a lot like him, he admitted, but it won't hold in court. Too blurry, too old. He sighed. Still, I remember that night. The fire started from the back door, not the grain bins. Eleanor's place caught light almost at the same time. Grace's voice was gentle. So, someone set both? Harwood nodded. Or made sure we thought so. Evening settled early under the storm. Stephen returned to the Finch house once more, unable to ignore the line in Eleanor's journal. Beneath the floor, where the river bends twice. He brought a crowbar and flashlight. Bear led the way, tail stiff, nose low. The rain hissed through the trees as they reached the small Riverside shed, once used for storing tools. The floorboards were warped from age, but one plank bore fresh scratches. He pried it up and found a narrow cavity below, lined with waterproof fabric. Inside were glass jars, sealed and labeled, records preserved. Each contained pages wrapped tight, still dry after 15 years. He lifted one jar carefully. Inside was a confession, written in careful script. I, AC, certify that the relief fund was altered by committee order. Mrs. Finch objected. She was threatened with indictment. I took the ledgers to protect her. Stephen's breath caught. Avery Collins had written this himself. A sharp sound made him turn. The crunch of gravel outside. Through the window, headlights glared, then went dark. Bear growled deep, the sound low and primal. Stephen stepped back, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. A shadow crossed the porch. Rain cascaded from the roof, muting every step. The door handle turned slightly, but did not open. Silence. Then a voice, hoarse, familiar, called softly. Mr. Archer, we should talk. It was Margaret Lang. She was drenched, her umbrella gone, eyes wide with urgency. They know you found it, she whispered. You're not safe tonight. Before Stephen could reply, the faint hum of another engine rose from the trees. Closer, heavier. Bear barked once, sharp as thunder. Margaret glanced toward the sound. "Please," she said, "trust me." The headlights flared again, sweeping across the wet grass, and for an instant Stephen saw the glint of a gold watch through the rain. The rain arrived like vengeance. It drummed on rooftops, hissed through gutters, and swallowed the distant hum of Silver Bend's sirens. By dusk, the Rogue River had burst its banks, gnawing at the edges of the old bridge. Stephen Archer stood by his truck, chest heaving against the downpour, the orange glow of his hazard lights flickering over the rising flood. Bear pressed close to his side, the black and tan shepherd's fur, slicked dark with rain, eyes steady and alert. They were no strangers to chaos. The old instincts of rescue, muscle memory from years long buried, returned like lightning in the blood. A vibration buzzed in Stephen's pocket. Grace's message. Children trapped in the music room. School road underwater. He didn't think, he moved. Boots splashing through the torrent, he swung into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The wipers clawed at the windshield as he sped toward the elementary school on the south bank. The world narrowed to headlights and rain, white lines dissolving under the flood's gray tongue. As he crested the hill, a flash of hazard beacons pierced the storm. A row of county vehicles blocked the main road. Warren Blake stood atop the levee, coat whipping in the wind, shouting orders through a bullhorn. His charcoal suit clung to him like armor. His gold watch gleamed even under the rain. "Turn back!" he barked. "The bridge is closed. Liability issues." His voice cut through the wind like a knife of authority. Stephen threw the truck into park and stepped out. "There are kids in there!" he shouted. Blake turned, eyes cold, voice steady but sharp. "Rescue units are en route. We can't risk unauthorized entry. If something goes wrong, the county gets sued, and this town—" "To hell with the county," Stephen snapped. "This town's already drowning." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, one hardened by greed, the other by guilt, and the wind howled between them. Then Stephen turned away. Bear growled low, as if echoing his master's defiance. The road beyond the barricade was half submerged. Stephen clipped his rescue harness to the tow line from his truck, double-checked the knots. "Stay close," he told Bear. The dog barked once, ready. Together they waded into the current, each step a battle against the water's pull. Debris rushed past, branches, shingles, a child's plastic toy boat. In another life, Stephen had saved burning houses. Tonight, he was saving a town from its own neglect. At the school's edge, floodwater lapped at the windowsills. The faint sound of crying drifted through the storm. Stephen pounded on the glass. "Fire rescue!" he yelled, though he wasn't one anymore. A small face appeared, pale and terrified. The door was jammed shut, swollen by the water. He wedged his crowbar into the gap, forced it open enough for Bear to slip inside first. The dog paddled across the flooded hallway, barking toward the sound of voices. In the music room, half a dozen children huddled on tables. The teacher, Ms. Riley, a young woman barely 30, drenched to the bone, was doing her best to calm them. She was tall and slight, freckles across her pale face, red hair plastered against her cheeks. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned steady with resolve. "The ceiling's cracking," she cried as Stephen burst in. "We can't hold much longer." "Get them by the window," he commanded. He tied a rope to a beam, secured the other end to his harness. "Bear, fetch!" The shepherd leapt into the water, swimming a curved path toward the window. Stephen swung it open. The cold river air hit like a slap. "One at a time," he shouted. The children clung to Bear's rope, sliding out through the window as he guided them toward the high ground outside. Grace's voice echoed faintly over the radio. "Ambulance is stuck 2 blocks away. Do what you can." One child slipped, and Stephen lunged, catching her wrist just as the floor groaned beneath them. The timbers were splitting. Ms. Riley shoved another student forward. "Go!" she yelled. A wooden beam cracked overhead. Bear turned sharply, barking in warning. Then the world snapped. A ceiling joist crashed down. In that breathless instant, Bear hurled himself forward, his body striking Stephen hard enough to knock him aside. The beam slammed into the dog's back with a sickening thud. Stephen's shout drowned under the thunder. "Bear!" he gasped. Blood darkened the water around them. He lifted the dog into his arms, staggering through waist-deep flood. Bear's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, his eyes still fixed on Stephen as if asking, "Is everyone safe?" "Almost, buddy," Stephen whispered, his throat raw. He carried him through the broken window to the embankment, where Grace waited with blankets, her face streaked with rain and tears. "There's one more inside," she said, voice trembling. Stephen turned back without hesitation. "Hold him," he told her. Grace nodded, pressing her hands against Bear's fur. "I will." Inside, the music room had become a cavern of echoes, the piano half submerged, strings snapping one by one. Stephen found the last child crouched beneath the teacher's desk, clutching a waterlogged violin case. "Got you," he said softly, scooping the boy into his arms. The rope tugged tight as he climbed through the window. Outside, a wall of headlights illuminated the chaos. Neighbors, rescue workers, parents, everyone shouting names into the storm. When Stephen emerged, cheers broke through the rain. Grace ran forward, wrapping the boy in a coat. Ms. Riley stumbled after him, eyes wide in disbelief. The flood had taken nearly everything, but the children were safe. Bear lay still beside Grace, chest rising faintly. Stephen knelt, his hands shaking. "You saved them all, partner," he whispered. The dog's amber eyes fluttered open once, then closed again, trusting. Warren Blake approached slowly, his shoes sinking into the mud, face pale under the flickering lights. "You had no authorization," he said, but the words fell flat. His voice lacked its usual venom, replaced by something like shame or fear. Grace stood, turning on him. "Authorization?" she said bitterly. "You care more for paperwork than people." Blake opened his mouth, then stopped. His watch, so polished, so proud, was splattered with mud and blood. He looked at it as though seeing it for the first time. The storm began to ease, replaced by the low moan of wind through the trees. The sirens faded into the distance. Stephen stayed by Bear's side, one hand resting on the dog's neck, the other gripping his rosary, a relic from a life before loss. The river, swollen and dark, slid past them, carrying away branches, debris, and perhaps a measure of guilt. Grace knelt beside him. "He'll pull through," she said quietly, though neither of them fully believed it. Then, over the hush of the retreating storm, came a sound, a faint metallic ping against the bridge railing. Stephen looked up. A gold watch lay half buried in the mud, its clasp broken, its face cracked but still ticking. He followed the trail of footprints leading away from it, fresh, heading toward the flooded road. He stood slowly, rain dripping from his hair, and whispered, "He's running." Behind him, the river answered with its own whisper, a deep, endless murmur like breath through stone, carrying the promise that nothing stays buried forever. The church smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain-soaked wood. Rows of folding cots filled the hall, where volunteers moved like slow shadows among the wounded. Stephen sat beside Bear in the makeshift medical corner, the German shepherd's fur darkened with blood at the flank. A young field medic, slim, with freckled arms and tired eyes, threaded the curved needle carefully. Bear's breathing rasped, yet his gaze never left Stephen's face. "Easy, boy. You did good," Stephen whispered, pressing his forehead to the dog's. The whisper trembled as though it came from the bottom of a well. Outside, the night coughed up thunder over Finch Hollow. Sirens still echoed faintly in the distance where the warehouse had burned. Grace appeared at the doorway, her olive gray coat damp, hair loosened from its bun, cheeks pale with worry. "They said he'll live," the medic murmured. Grace exhaled slowly, crossing the room, her boots leaving small wet prints on the old church floor. She crouched beside Stephen and laid a trembling hand on Bear's paw. "He's stronger than most people I know," she said softly. The next morning, the town gathered in the old municipal hall. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as rain tapped on the windows. Sheriff Doyle Whitaker, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, his badge dulled by time, stood behind the podium. Stephen stepped forward carrying a weathered tin box and a stack of files. "Found these in the collapsed beam," he said, voice gravelly. Inside the box were ledgers, contracts, and one old wristwatch, its golden face charred yet intact. Grace, standing beside him, began to read the list aloud. Names of families who had received food rations during the relief drive, each marked with a crimson cross. Her tone was calm but steady, each syllable like a nail hammered into truth. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Insurance claims, falsified signatures, this matches the warehouse records." His eyes shifted to the back of the room, where Warren sat, suit wrinkled, eyes hollow, hands gripping the chair's edge. "You burned it all to hide your tracks," Doyle said flatly. Warren rose unsteadily. "You don't understand. The town was dying. I had to..." but the words drowned beneath the murmur of the crowd, the sound of disbelief and quiet anger. When it was over, Stephen didn't feel victorious. He felt old. The kind of old that has less to do with years and more with weight, of smoke, of loss, of memory. As the sheriff led Warren away, Grace touched Stephen's arm. "There's something you should see," she said. Later that afternoon, they stood on the porch of the Finch house, the same one Stephen had almost sold months ago. Rain had washed the air clean, leaving behind the scent of wet pine and ashes. Grace handed him a folded envelope. Inside, on Eleanor Finch's yellowed stationery, was a note. "If you're reading this, it means you stayed. Thank you for not letting the town forget what kindness can rebuild." Stephen stared at the words until they blurred. "I'm keeping her name on this place," he said quietly, "not as a property, but as something we owe her." Grace smiled faintly. "A community center?" "A start," he nodded. By the next week, Finch House buzzed again, but this time with laughter, not arguments. Volunteers scrubbed soot from walls, children painted wooden signs. Stephen, sleeves rolled, hammered a brass plate above the door. Finch House Community Center. On a small table by the entrance sat Bear's old collar beside a donation jar labeled Bear Finch Rescue Scholarship Fund. He had already pledged half his next commission to it, others followed. That evening, Grace joined him on the bookstore porch. The rain had thinned into a mist that silvered her hair. She placed a paper cup of coffee beside his hand. "You didn't just save a building, Stephen," she said, her voice low and rich. "You reminded people how to build trust." He chuckled softly. "Maybe I should start charging extra for storytelling." Her laughter, quiet, surprised, lingered in the cool air. Then silence settled, not heavy but warm, filled with the ticking of raindrops on the awning. Grace rested her hand on his, gentle, certain, as one who has learned that healing never comes in grand gestures, but in small, steady ones. Bear stirred at Stephen's feet, raising his head, the scar still pink but his eyes bright. Outside, the church bell tolled softly over Finch Hollow, each echo falling like a benediction on a town reborn. Winter withdrew gently from Silver Bend, like a soft scarf being pulled from the shoulders of the town. The snow thinned to lace along the gutters, and the scent of thawed earth carried faintly on the morning wind. In the backyard of Finch House, Bear walked clumsily on the damp grass, one leg still stiff from the wound. The scar across his flank gleamed faintly under the pale sun, like a narrow river curving through fur and memory. Children passing by waved to him, shouting, "Good boy, Bear!" And the German shepherd, proud and mild-eyed, wagged his tail without breaking stride. The townspeople had gathered to prepare for the dedication ceremony. Finch House had been transformed. White curtains fluttered at the windows, the front porch lined with flower pots, and the air inside smelled of varnished wood and new beginnings. Stephen adjusted the brass plaque by the entrance, tracing the engraved words with his calloused thumb. "To live quietly is not to be forgotten, but to build a life the world cannot destroy." Grace arrived with a basket of muffins, her hair streaked silver under the morning sun. She was wearing a charcoal gray coat and a long wool skirt that swayed softly as she walked. There was something luminous in her calmness, the way her presence steadied every noise around her. "You made it just in time," Stephen said, his voice carrying both warmth and awe. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied, smiling faintly. "Not after what you and Bear have done." Among the crowd stood Sheriff Doyle Whitaker, tall and broad as ever, his tan jacket freshly pressed, brass badge polished to a mellow glow. He leaned on the porch railing beside a young woman holding a camera, a reporter from the Willow County Chronicle. Her name was Marianne Clark, in her early 30s, with chestnut hair tucked beneath a gray beret and a sharp, curious look in her eyes. She was the kind who never simply reported events. She listened for the heartbeat beneath them. "You think the town's really turning a corner?" she asked the sheriff quietly. Doyle rubbed his chin. "Maybe it's not about turning, maybe it's about remembering where we started." As the crowd settled, Stephen stepped to the front. His old field jacket, though neatly brushed, still carried faint burns and patches sewn years ago, a quiet testimony to his rescue days. He looked over the faces before him, the townspeople he had once thought too distant to reach. "When I first came here," he began, "I thought selling houses was about closing doors behind you, but sometimes it's about opening the ones people thought were lost forever." His voice wavered slightly, but held. Grace stood nearby, her hands clasped, her eyes glistening. The children helped unveil the plaque, laughter scattering into the breeze. The choir from the church sang a simple hymn about light and mercy. Then, as people clapped, Stephen felt something warm press against his leg. Bear, sitting upright, tail sweeping slow arcs on the porch boards. The dog's amber eyes caught the sunlight, alive, unbroken. Stephen knelt, his hand resting on that scarred shoulder. "You're a part of this too, partner," he murmured. When the ceremony ended, the townsfolk lingered, talking, hugging, some even crying quietly. Doyle shook Stephen's hand. "Got word this morning," he said, lowering his voice. District Attorney's Office filed charges against Warren Blake. Fraud, arson, misuse of relief funds, the whole stack. Stephen nodded, the satisfaction not of triumph, but of justice fulfilled. Doyle continued, "And they've cleared Eleanor Finch's name. Official statement goes out tomorrow. About time, huh?" That evening, Finch House glowed with lamplight. The main room had been arranged with donated bookshelves, each labeled with families' names who had contributed. Grace was kneeling beside a low table, arranging lilies in an old glass jar. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and coffee. Stephen leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You know," he said softly, "if you ever run out of shelf space at your store, I've got some empty walls at my place." Grace looked up, half smiling, eyes shimmering, as if catching two dawns at once. The one outside, fading gold, and the one inside, still growing. "Only if there's room for Bear," she replied. The dog thumped his tail as if signing the agreement himself. Laughter followed, light and full, like the creak of an old door opening for the first time in years. Later, as dusk settled over Silver Bend, a text buzzed on Stephen's phone. Confirmation from the prosecutor's office. The case against Warren was moving forward, Eleanor's honor restored. He showed it to Grace, and she reached for his hand. No words, just the quiet knowing that some endings don't close. They heal. That night, Stephen walked through Finch House alone. He paused by the framed note from Eleanor, now hung above the fireplace. Outside, snowmelt trickled down the gutters, and Bear slept near the hearth, head resting on Stephen's worn boots. The realtor turned rescuer turned storyteller watched the flames flicker, each light reflecting the truth of two lives mended, his and the town's. When he finally went home, he hung his old rescue helmet beside the keys of his real estate office. For years, those two worlds had seemed separate, one saving lives, the other selling them dreams. But now he understood. Both were about faith in what could still be rebuilt. Both required walking into smoke and trusting there'd be air on the other side. Outside, dawn began again, soft, unhurried, golden across the hills. Sometimes God doesn't send us miracles wrapped in light. He sends them in fur, with tired paws and loyal eyes. Bear's courage wasn't just about saving lives that night by the river. It was God's quiet reminder that love and faith still move through this world, even in silence, even through scars. When we rebuild what's broken, a home, a memory, or a heart, we become His hands for a moment. Maybe that's the real miracle, not what we find, but what we restore. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who could use a little faith tonight. Leave a prayer or a thought below. We read them all, and every word matters. And if you believe that love, loyalty, and grace can still change the world, don't forget to subscribe, so that together we can keep telling stories of hope. May God bless you, your loved ones, and every quiet hero walking beside you, human or not.